In this episode, we move from the idea of risk as something you analyze once into the more realistic idea of risk as something that changes as the system and its environment change. Early learners often imagine that once a risk assessment is completed and approved, the system is basically safe unless something dramatic happens, like a major breach or a catastrophic outage. Real systems do not work that way, because they are constantly being updated, connected to new things, used by new groups of people, and influenced by a threat landscape that keeps evolving. The job, then, is not only to identify risks, but to keep watching for how those risks behave after controls are applied and after reality starts pushing back on your assumptions. That ongoing watching has three major targets: residual risks that remain after mitigation, changed risks that shift because conditions shift, and new risks that appear because something new has been introduced. When you can track all three calmly and consistently, you prevent yesterday's confidence from becoming tomorrow's surprise. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. Residual risk is the easiest concept to define and one of the hardest to respect emotionally, because people want the comfort of believing a control solved the problem completely. Residual risk is what remains after you put mitigations in place, and it exists because controls are never perfect, coverage is never complete, and attackers and failures do not follow polite boundaries. If you reduce a vulnerability, you might still have exposure through other paths, or you might have a smaller but still meaningful chance of the same kind of event. If you improve monitoring, you reduce time to detect, but you still may not detect every subtle attempt, and you might still have gaps during outages or maintenance. Beginners sometimes hear residual risk and interpret it as pessimism, but it is actually a sign of maturity, because it acknowledges that security is about reducing and managing risk, not eliminating it. Monitoring residual risk means you keep checking whether the remaining exposure is still within decision criteria and whether the controls are working as intended in daily operations. It also means you keep a clear record of which risks were accepted and under what conditions, so acceptance does not turn into neglect. Changed risk is about recognizing that the same risk statement can become more or less severe when the world around the system changes, even if the system's core design stays the same. A risk can change because a new vulnerability is discovered in a dependency, because a new class of attacker behavior becomes common, or because the organization changes how it uses the system. Something as simple as adding a new user group can change the likelihood of misuse, because more users usually means more variance in training and behavior. Changes in staffing can change detection and response performance, because fewer skilled responders can increase time to detect or repair, increasing impact even if the underlying vulnerability is unchanged. Changed risk also appears when business priorities shift, because a system that was once low criticality can become mission critical, which instantly raises availability and integrity impact. Monitoring changed risk therefore requires you to watch for changes in context, not only changes in technical configuration. When you treat context as living rather than frozen, you can see risk shifts early and respond before they become incidents. New risk is the category that often surprises teams, not because new risks are rare, but because teams fail to notice that something new has been introduced. A new risk can appear when you add a new integration, when you adopt a new vendor service, when you enable a new feature, or when you expand the system to new data types. Sometimes new risk appears because the system evolves in small increments until it becomes something different, like an application that starts as an internal tool and slowly becomes internet exposed. New risks also appear when you adopt new operational practices, like automating a process that used to have human review, or shifting work to remote access methods that create new access paths. Beginners sometimes assume that new risks will be announced loudly, but in practice, they often arrive quietly through routine change and convenience decisions. Monitoring new risk, therefore, means paying attention to the system's boundaries and dependencies and noticing when those boundaries expand. The discipline is to ask, what is different now, and what new harm becomes plausible because of that difference? To monitor these risk categories well, You need a way to observe system reality, because you cannot manage what you cannot see. Observation includes technical signals like logs, alerts, vulnerability findings, configuration drift detection, and incident reports, but it also includes process signals like changes in approval patterns, recurring exceptions, and signs that people are bypassing controls to get work done. A control that looks strong on paper can become weak in reality if it is routinely overridden, if alerts are ignored because they are too noisy, or if administrators share credentials because the process is too slow. Monitoring risk is therefore not just monitoring technology. It is monitoring behavior and process health as well. For beginners, it helps to see that systems are socio-technical, meaning people and technology interact, and risk emerges from that interaction. Good monitoring includes watching for friction points that lead to workarounds, because workarounds often become unplanned attack paths. When you connect technical telemetry with operational reality, you gain a more truthful picture of risk posture. A practical way to avoid being overwhelmed is to anchor monitoring in the decisions and assumptions that mattered most during earlier risk evaluation. Every risk assessment includes assumptions, like expected patch timeliness, expected log coverage, or expected access governance quality. Monitoring should revisit those assumptions and ask whether they still hold, because when an assumption fails, residual risk grows or changed risk appears. For example, if you assumed that administrative access would be tightly limited, but over time more accounts gain privileged roles, the risk posture shifts even if no incident occurs. If you assumed that a vendor would provide timely patches, but patch cadence slows, inherent exposure becomes harder to reduce. The idea is not to audit everything constantly, but to watch the few conditions that, if they drift, will matter a lot. This is an engineering habit of focusing on leading indicators, not only lagging indicators. Leading indicators are the early signs that risk is increasing, such as growing backlog, expanding privileges, or decreased test coverage. Monitoring also requires clear triggers for when something becomes worth escalating, because not every change or alert should produce a crisis. Triggers can be tied to decision criteria, such as any event that affects sensitive data, any evidence of unauthorized privilege changes, or any outage that exceeds acceptable downtime for mission functions. Triggers can also be tied to patterns, like repeated near misses that show a control is brittle, or repeated exceptions that suggest a policy is misaligned with real workflow. The point of triggers is to prevent two dangerous extremes: constant alarm that burns everyone out, and silence that hides growing exposure until it becomes unmanageable. Beginners should understand that escalation is a design choice, and good escalation design creates confidence that important signals will be noticed. When triggers are explicit, teams can respond consistently, and leaders can see that risk management is not arbitrary. This also protects credibility, because you avoid sounding reactive one day and indifferent the next. Residual risk monitoring is especially dependent on whether controls remain effective over time, because controls can degrade in subtle ways. A logging control can degrade when new components are added without onboarding logs, when storage fills up, or when an update changes event formats. An access control can degrade when roles are expanded informally, when emergency privileges become permanent, or when identity integrations drift from original design. A patching process can degrade when maintenance windows shrink, when test environments become unreliable, or when dependencies make updates harder. These degradations often look like ordinary operational issues, but they directly increase residual risk because they reduce your safety margin. Monitoring, therefore, includes periodic validation, meaning you confirm that the control still produces the outcomes it was supposed to produce. For beginners, it is important to see that validation is not distrust. It is maintenance of trust. When you validate routinely, you discover control decay early, when restoring effectiveness is easier. Changed risk monitoring becomes more effective when you pay attention to the external environment as well as internal changes, because threats and dependencies can shift without your system doing anything. A new vulnerability in a widely used component can instantly change likelihood, even if you have not touched your system. A change in attacker behavior can make a previously low-priority weakness more attractive, especially if attackers develop automation that lowers the effort needed to exploit it. Vendor changes can also shift risk, such as changes in support practices, changes in service architecture, or changes in how updates are delivered. Even regulatory changes can shift impact, because a data exposure that was once primarily reputational can become legally expensive under new rules. Monitoring changed risk is therefore partly about awareness of relevant change, not in a news-driven, panic-driven way, but in a controlled way tied to your system's dependencies. Beginners should focus on the idea that dependencies are part of the system, because you inherit their risk behavior. When you track dependency changes, you reduce the chance of being surprised by someone else's failure. New risk monitoring is strongest when it is embedded in change management, because new risk often enters through planned change. Anytime you add a new interface, add a new data flow, adopt a new service, or change a workflow, you are creating a new shape of system behavior. The mistake is thinking that if change is approved for functionality, security will naturally be fine, because security consequences are often indirect. A small feature can create a large new attack surface, and a convenient integration can create a privileged pathway that was never intended. Monitoring new risk means ensuring that changes are reviewed for their effect on threat exposure and control coverage, and it means ensuring that monitoring and response plans are updated to match what changed. It also means watching for unplanned change, like shadow processes, informal data exports, or unofficial integrations. Beginners should understand that unplanned change is common because people solve problems creatively, and that creativity can accidentally bypass security assumptions. When you create a culture where change is visible, new risk becomes manageable instead of mysterious. An important part of monitoring is how you record what you learn, because monitoring without documentation turns into repeated rediscovery and inconsistent decisions. When residual risk remains acceptable, you should record why it remains acceptable and what signals you are using to confirm stability. When changed risk is detected, you should record what changed and what that implies for likelihood and impact, so the next review is faster and more consistent. When new risk is found, you should capture the new exposure, the relevant assumptions that were broken, and the decision on treatment, so the organization can learn and adjust processes. This record-keeping is not about creating a mountain of paperwork. It is about preserving the reasoning trail that makes risk posture defendable. For beginners, it helps to think of documentation as memory for the organization, because organizations forget faster than people expect. When you preserve decisions and rationales, you reduce the chance that a future team repeats an avoidable mistake. Documentation also supports accountability, because it makes ownership and follow-through visible. Monitoring also needs feedback loops that lead to action, otherwise it becomes a passive reporting exercise. If monitoring shows that a control is drifting, the feedback loop should lead to remediation, such as tightening roles, improving onboarding, or adjusting thresholds and coverage. If monitoring shows that certain risks are consistently resurfacing, the feedback loop might lead to redesign, because repeated fixes suggest the underlying structure is wrong. If monitoring shows that the environment has changed, the feedback loop might lead to re-evaluating decision criteria, because what was tolerable may no longer be tolerable given new mission dependence or new threat pressure. Beginners should understand that feedback loops are what turns monitoring into management. The loop is observation, interpretation, decision, action, and verification, and the cycle repeats as the system evolves. When the loop is healthy, risk posture stays aligned with reality, and when the loop is broken, risk becomes a collection of stale statements that do not reflect the system you actually have. A subtle but important beginner misunderstanding is thinking that monitoring is primarily about catching attackers, when in many systems the bigger value is catching drift and catching precursors to failure. Attack detection is important, but many damaging outcomes come from routine misconfigurations, delayed maintenance, and fragile dependencies that collapse under normal stress. Monitoring risk means watching for those precursors, like growing patch backlog, expanding administrative access, reduced log fidelity, or recurring exceptions that weaken policy. These signals are not as dramatic as a breach alert, but they are often more actionable and more predictive of future incidents. When you can explain to stakeholders that these indicators represent rising residual risk or changed risk, you make it easier to justify preventative work. This prevents the organization from being trapped in a reactive cycle where it only invests after harm occurs. Monitoring, in that sense, is how you buy time. and time is often the most valuable asset in security response and resilience. As you bring these ideas together, the key is to see that residual, changed, and new risks are not separate topics, but different ways reality updates your risk posture. Residual risk is the reminder that controls reduce risk but do not erase it, so you must verify effectiveness over time. Changed risk is the reminder that the same system can become riskier or safer as context shifts, so assumptions must be revisited. New risk is the reminder that systems evolve through change, so boundaries and dependencies must be watched so new exposure is noticed early. When you monitor all three categories with disciplined observation, clear triggers, and feedback loops that lead to action, you keep risk management connected to the system you actually operate. This makes risk decisions calmer, because you are not guessing, and it makes decisions more defensible, because you can show how risk changed and why you responded. That is the practical meaning of monitoring risk as system reality shifts, and it is a core competency for security engineering that aims to stay true over time rather than sounding confident only on launch day.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.